Good morning. This is Ron. It is Thursday, April the 25th. Welcome to Story Time. So again, this morning I'm going to be going ahead and doing my editorial and then starting chapter 16 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And then critiquing a little bit of Rush Limbaugh, except instead of from his show, I'm going to be critiquing him. He was interviewed by Playboy magazine, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. And so I have a copy of that, and I'm going to go ahead and critique his responses to the interview. And then after that, the New York City joke book. So this morning, the one thing I wanted to cover is that I consider myself to be the only true conservative in the United States of America, because the only definition of conservatism that's really worth anything, that's really valid, is the following. A conservative is a person that makes the presumption for the status quo. In other words, the difference between conservative and socialist, or another way would be looking at it would be realist, that a conservative is automatically a realist, and that socialists are idealists, and that the difference between the two is where you stand on change. Do you make the presumption for the status quo, or do you make the presumption for change? And by making the presumption for the status quo, I'm saying, for instance, in my own life, if I run into a problem and I ask, what should I do? The first question I've got to ask myself is, what am I doing now? And analyze that. And then at the result of that analysis will give me an answer as to whether or not I need to change. I need to, in other words, whether or not I need to do anything at all. And a lot of times I don't. And that's the same thing that I and you need to do when we're approaching problems of civics and problems of politics and social policy. When you hear people asking about, say, on the news, on television or the radio, about what should we do about X, and then again, first question you got to ask yourself is, what are we doing now? And then ask yourself, what's wrong with what we're doing now? And if you can't answer that question, then we don't need to change. We don't need to do anything else. And if obviously, if you can answer that question, then we go ahead and start looking for doing some problem solving and trying to find out what's the best possible solution to the problem at hand. Okay, when I come back, I'm going to be starting chapter 16 of Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Okay, so I'm back, and chapter 16 is called Fairness Doctrine for Education, written in 1972. And it goes into, before I get into it and reading it, it's deals with something that is called the Fairness Doctrine. Was something that happened back in the day when news departments and news on television was offered as a public service. It was a non-profit operation. And that's the reason that our news departments and our news people had a tremendous amount of credibility. They were people that you generally, if the news people said something was so, it was so. You could trust them. There's a lot of trust in the news people. People talk about Walter Cronkite, but it wasn't just Walter Cronkite that was really ironclad, had a black belt in respectability, let's put it that way. But all the news departments did because they were nonprofit. So the only thing that the news agencies were interested in really was integrity, credibility, and influence, as it should be. That's the way it should be today. We should be getting rid of nonprofit or for-profit news and go back to nonprofit news. But I think for-profit news came by either in the late 70s or early 80s. But anyways, when we had nonprofit news, there was something called the Fairness Doctrine, and the idea was to make sure that opinions of differing sides or viewpoints were represented, at least in the news media. So you would have, if you're watching the local news department might make an editorial and say, well, this is the way we feel about a new tax, for instance. And then if somebody representing a group with that had an opposing viewpoint wanted to be on the air, then they could come on the air and rebut the editorial position or attempt to rebut the editorial position of the television station. So, and then what she's basically saying is also says, because it says Fairness Doctrine for Education, is that if we're going to have a fairness doctrine, then we should have it for education, i.e., for schools. The, quote, fairness doctrine, unquote, is a messy little makeshift of the mixed economy and a poor substitute for freedom of speech. It has, however, served as a minimal retarder of the collectivist trend. It has prevented the establishment's total takeover of the airwaves. For this reason, as a temporary measure in a grave national emergency, the fairness doctrine should now be invoked in behalf of education. The doctrine is a typical product of the socialist sentimentality that dreams of combining government ownership with intellectual freedom. As applied to television and radio broadcasting, the Fairness Doctrine demands that equal opportunity be given to all sides of a controversial issue on the grounds of the notion that, quote, the people own the airwaves, unquote, and therefore all factions of the people should have equal access to their communal property. The trouble with the Fairness Doctrine is that it cannot be applied fairly. Like any ideological product of the mixed economy, it is a vague, indefinable approximation and, therefore, an instrument of pressure group warfare. Who determines which issues are controversial? Who chooses the representatives of the different sides in a given controversy? If there are too many conflicting viewpoints, which are to be given a voice and which are to be kept silent? Who is, quote, the people, unquote, and who is not? And I want to interject here that she actually got it wrong here. She said the trouble with the Fairness Doctrine is that it can't be applied fairly. Well, no, the trouble with the Fairness Doctrine is that it's anti-property. It concludes that there is such thing as collective property, and there is no such thing. There's individuals own property. Collectives do not own property. So that's the problem is because it says all factions of the people should have equal access to their communal property. So how do you make sure that each individual is able to have their fair share? It's like any other public property where you have the public sidewalk. Well, what if I want I want to have stake out my little piece of the sidewalk. I want to take maybe 1 square foot, and I'm going to fence it off and make sure nobody else uses it. Well, I can't do that. And if I decide that I want to spit on the sidewalk, but there might be laws against that, or I want to litter on the sidewalk or litter on the roads, as I might do in my house. If I have my house or my property, I might decide that I'm going to throw some trash on my front lawn, or I have a candy wrapper and I just might want to in the house throw it on the floor. It's my property. I can do with it as I see fit. And so the idea of what you end up with is not communal property, but you end up with the political party, basically, whatever political party happens to be in charge at the time owns the public property. And the same thing here. That's the problem with it, because there's no way to administer the public property fairly or in a good way because of that. So she didn't get deep enough in her analysis there. It is clear that the individual's views are barred altogether and that the fairness is extended only to groups. The formula employed by the television stations in New York declares that they recognize their obligation to provide equal time to significant opposing viewpoints. Who determines which viewpoint is significant? Is the standard qualitative or quantitative? It is obviously this last, as one may observe in practice. Wherever an answer is given to a TV editorial, it is given by a representative of some group involved in the debated subject. The Fairness Doctrine, as well as the myth of public ownership, now she begins to cover what I was talking about, is based on the favorite illusion of the mushy socialists, i.e., those who want to combine force and freedom as distinguished from the bloody socialists, i.e., the communists and the fascists. The illusion is that the belief that the people, the masses, would be essentially unanimous, that dissenting groups would be rare and easily accommodated, that a monolithic majority will would prevail, and that any injustice done would be done only to recalcitrant individuals who, in socialist theory, do not count anyway. For a discussion of why the airwaves should be private property, see, quote, the property status of airwaves, unquote, in my book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. In practice, the Fairness Doctrine has led to the precarious rule of a centrist attitude of timidity, compromise, and fear, with the center slithering slowly, inexorably to the left, i.e., controlled by the establishment, limited only by the remnants of tradition of freedom, by lip service to impartiality, by fear of being caught at too obvious an unfairness, and by the practice of window dressing, which consists in some occasional moments of airtime tossed to some representatives of extreme and actually significant opposing viewpoints. Such a policy, by its very nature, is temporary. Nevertheless, this window dressing is the last chance that the advocates of freedom have as far as the airwaves are concerned. There is no equivalent of the Fairness Doctrine in the field, which is much more important to a nature's future than its airwaves, the field which determines a country's intellectual trends, the dominant ideas in people's mind, in the culture, in the establishment, in the press, and ultimately on the air, the field of higher education. So long as higher education was provided predominantly by private colleges and universities, no problem of unfairness existed. A private school has the right to teach any ideas of its owner's choice and to exclude all opposing ideas, but it has no power to force such exclusion on the rest of the country. The opponents have the right to establish schools of their own and to teach their ideas or a wider spectrum of viewpoints, if they so choose. The competition of the free marketplace of ideas does the rest, determining every school's success or failure, which, historically, was the course of the development of the great private universities. But the growth of government power, of state universities, of taxation through the private universities, and of taxation brought the private universities under growing control by and dependence on the government. The most common, ominously crucial question now hanging over this country's future is, what will our universities teach at our expense and without our consent? What ideas will be propagated or excluded? This question applies to all public and semi-public institutions of learning. By semi-public, I mean those formerly private institutions which are to be supported in part by public funds and controlled in full by the government. The government has no right to set itself up as the arbiter of ideas, and therefore its establishments, the public and semi-public schools, have no right to teach a single viewpoint, excluding all others. They have no right to serve the beliefs of any one group of citizens, leaving others ignored and silenced. They have no right to impose inequality on the citizens who bear equally the burden of supporting them. As in the case of governmental grants to science, it is viciously wrong to force an individual to pay for the teaching of ideas diametrically opposed to his own. It is a profound violation of his rights. The violation becomes monstrous if his ideas are excluded from such public teaching. This means that he is forced to pay for the propagation of that which he regards as false and evil, and for the suppression of that which he regards as true and good. If there is a viler form of injustice, I challenge any resident of Washington, D.C. to name it. Yet, this is the form of injustice committed by the present policy of an overwhelming majority of our public and semi-public universities. There's a widespread impression that television and the press are biased and slanted to the left, but they are models of impartiality and fairness compared to the ferocious intolerance, the bias, the prejudices, the distortions, the savage obscurantism now running riot in most of our institutions of higher learning in regard to matters deeper than mere politics. With rare exceptions, each of the various departments and disciplines is ruled by its own particular clique that gets in and virtually excludes the teaching of any theory or viewpoint other than its own. If a private school permits this, it has the right to do so. A public or semi-public school has not. And that's going to be it for this part of Chapter 16 called The Fairness Doctrine for Education from the book Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. And when I come back, critique of Rush Limbaugh. Okay, so I'm back, and let me see if I can find out what the date of this is. Let's see here. December 1993 is the interview by Playboy magazine of, let's see, I want to get back to the place. There it is. So, December 1993. I first encountered Rush Limbaugh when I came back I was in the Air Force, and I had been stationed in Germany, what was then called West Germany, and I was reassigned to a base in Texas, in San Antonio. And when I came back, the individual that I was to supervise told me, he says, "You got to listen to this guy, Rush Limbaugh." Said he's really something else. And so that's when I first started listening to. This was in 1989. I think Rush Limbaugh was syndicated in '88. So it was about a year after he started becoming syndicated, I started listening to his show. As far as I'm concerned, his show can be divided into three segments, parts: pre-addiction, addiction, and post-addiction. And so that when I was listening to him in '89, it was pre-addiction, as is this interview in 1993. It's a pre-addiction interview. So one of the things that I'm looking to critique here, and I'm looking at in interviews, is interviewers set people up. They set little traps that the vast majority of people are unaware of, including Rush Limbaugh. And so I want to take some time to point out what those traps are and how Rush Limbaugh, and anyone else for that matter, should deal with them. Or in this particular case, Rush Limbaugh should have dealt with it and should deal with it in the future. So it's not quite in the middle of the interview, but into it a little bit. Playboy asks, "Let's step back from this a bit. Despite your following, some people look at you as just a phenomenon." Limbaugh, that's exactly right. Less than a phenomenon, a fad. They don't take me seriously. Quote, "This guy is going to burn out. He's not going to make it," unquote. I love that. Well, let those guys continue to take me less than seriously, and I'll continue to do end runs around them. Now, the problem is that, again, it's a setup question, because he says, despite your following, some people look at you as just a phenomenon. The key words there are some people. Really? Which people? You can't concede that point. Okay, you have to make the interviewer prove it. Which people? Come out and name them. Who are they? Because this is what the interviewer is doing, is creating a foundation. He's doing what any good lawyer will do. And starting at the bottom, create a foundation and build his case as they go along. So that as you're building that foundation, later on down the line, when the interviewer wants to draw some conclusions that may shock you, as if you're being interviewed, or in this case, Rush Limbaugh, that might shock and upset Mr. Limbaugh, and he might say, "Well, wait a minute, that's not where I'm coming from at all," or "You're painting a picture of me that's inaccurate," then they can go back to the beginning and say, "Well, wait a minute, I asked you this question and you conceded the point. I asked you another question, you conceded that point." And so slowly, little by little, they end up painting you into a corner. Like I said, what he should have said was, when they said, "Despite your following, some people look at you as just a phenomenon." And he can either ask the question, who, or the simplest, easiest, most potent way to do it is just simply denial. Say, no, they don't. There is no such people. Those people don't exist. Put the interviewer in the position of where they either have to change the question or provide proof. So then the next question. There are also those who just laugh and say, "Oh, look, isn't Rush Limbaugh funny?" Limbaugh, "Yeah, imagine that, a funny conservative. Isn't that a novelty? What a great circus America has become." And again, it's the same thing. There are those also. Who are they? And you've got to make the interviewer, or if you're talking to your friends, your neighbors, whoever that says this kind of thing to you, well, there's these people, those people, there are some people. Who? You got to get them to be specific. Got to get them to nail them down. And if they won't, then don't answer the question. Because again, they're setting subtle traps that they can use to play gotcha with later on. But that might be a gotcha like, aha, well, so you're a racist, or aha, so you hate women, you're a misogynist. No, I didn't say that at all. Well, sure you did. I asked you this question and you answered it. And by answering it, you conceded the point, type of thing. So, let's see what else. Oh, with all this debate about your impact, Playboy, are you still having fun? Limbaugh, yeah, it hasn't stopped being fun. I couldn't do all that if I couldn't do all that I do if it weren't fun. And if it ever stops, that's when I will seriously consider bringing it to a close. Two things for this. First of all, again, the Playboy asked, with all this debate about your impact, so they don't even state some people or those people. They just say, with all this debate about your impact. What debate? What debate? If I was, again, Rush Limbaugh, the proper answer is there is no debate. The best answer, the most powerful answer is there is no debate. What do you mean a debate about my impact? I have a tremendous impact, and there's no debate about it. And that puts again the interviewer in the position of either, well, number one, going along with it. Number two is changing the question, saying, never mind, let me ask you something else, or providing evidence and or proof that there is debate about the impact. Now, the interesting question is, are you still having fun? One of the things, the features of the left, of the political left, and of idealists, is that the meaning of life is to have fun, simply put, and that if you're not having fun, then you're wasting your time. That you have to have fun, and furthermore, having fun is about acting impulsively. So if you're not acting impulsively, you're not truly free, and you're not truly having fun, and you're wasting your life. And it's a counter-cultural, counter America, counter capitalism kind of thing, where decades ago the idea was idle hands are the devil's workshop. The idea was that you wanted to be, this country started and was founded with the idea of being productive, going out and making a living, going out, uh, making a farm, creating a farm, and producing crops, or going to work every day if you're going to work for somebody else. Or in the case of Paul Revere, he was a silversmith, so doing your silversmith work. But the idea was not to have fun. That wasn't the purpose of the meaning of life at all. It was along the ideas of happiness, but not strictly psychological happiness, but also including having a happy life, which includes moral and ethical issues. And part of that is being productive, being working and creating something for yourself. So the interviewer slips this into the conversation, and Rush Limbaugh went for it. I mean, just boldly. He basically, and this is where Rush Limbaugh has a credibility problem. And this is the reason he doesn't have as much influence as he possibly could because of this um, credibility issue he's got. Limbaugh, yeah, it hasn't stopped being fun. I couldn't do all that I do if it weren't fun, and if it ever stops, that's when I will seriously consider bringing it to a close. So he doesn't say, what he should have said was, when they, well, it's not about fun. That's not what life is about. It is about putting across a message or messages and getting those messages across to people. It is about, particularly for Rush Limbaugh, if there is a meaning to life, it's got to be, besides pursuing happiness, it's got to be influencing people, and particularly for Rush Limbaugh in his line of work. Is clearly what it is that he tries to do is influence his listeners and That's the point of what it is that he's doing. And what he should have said was, if it ever gets to the point where I cease to have influence or cease to have the level of influence I think I should have, that's when I've got to consider either I got to take a hard look at myself and either change the way I'm doing business or shut it down. That's what he should have said. Okay, so that's going to be my little critique for the time being for Rush Limbaugh. And when we come back, it will be New York City joke book time. Okay, we're back. Let's see. Where are we at? Here we are. Okay. Let's see. An 80-year-old woman is sitting on, well, let me first introduce by saying I'm reading from the New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book by Jim Peach. An 80-year-old woman is sitting on her porch one day when she sees an old lamp near the bottom of her steps. She picks it up, rubs it gently, and lo and behold, a genie appears. The genie tells the woman that he will grant her any 3 wishes her heart desires. She says immediately, I would like to be young and beautiful. And poof, in a cloud of smoke, she becomes young, beautiful, voluptuous blonde. The genie says, and what, madam, will be your second wish? The beautiful woman says, I would like to be rich for the rest of my life. Poof, when the smoke clears, there's stacks and stacks of $100 bills all around her. The genie says, now, madam, what will be your final wish? Well, says the woman, I would like for you to turn my old faithful cat, whom I have loved dearly for 15 years, into a young, handsome prince. And with another puff of smoke, the cat is changed into a tall, handsome prince with dark hair and a glittering medal on his coat. The first thing the prince does is lean over to the woman and whisper into her ear, now aren't you sorry you had me neutered? What do you get when you cross a rooster and an owl? A cock that stays up all night. A man dies and goes to hell. He's walking along when one of the devil's associates down there tells him, it's now time for you to decide. Decide what? Says the man. You must now choose among these doors here the room in which you want to spend the rest of eternity. They walk along, and behind one door they hear screaming and yelling and glass being broken. The man doesn't even want to look in, so they just pass on to the next door. Here, accompanying the screaming and yelling, are loud explosions. The man quickly proceeds to the next door. Behind this door is silence. The man says, can we look in here? The associate opens the door, and the man sees a room full of people standing in manure up to their waists, drinking coffee. This doesn't look so bad, says the man. I think I'll go in here. He walks in, and as the door closes and bolts behind him, he hears a whistle and a loud voice that says, okay, coffee break's over, back on your heads. What's Irish and stays out all night? Patio furniture. 2 Swedish guys get off a ship and head for the nearest bar. Each one orders 2 whiskeys and immediately downs them. They then order 2 more whiskeys apiece and once again quickly throw them back. They then order another 2 whiskeys apiece. One of them picks up one of his drinks and turning to the other man says, Skål! The other man turns to the first man and says, hey, did you come here to bullshit or did you come here to drink? And that's it for today's episode of New York City Cab Driver's Joke Book and for this episode of Story Time. Thank you very much for joining me, and until tomorrow, have a great day.